Today, we become legends.
Smite 2's OB1 patch brought a ton of change to the game, with conquest additions, new gods, sweeping balance changes, aspects, and more. OB2 brought less, but still some significant balance changes and a few new gods, so I think it's about time to update my top gods for every role series for the current meta. And since we now have almost 50 gods in the game, it's probably time to make it a top 3 for every role once again. As always, this list is a combination of my own experience in Diamond Plus Ranked, other top player tier lists, and general community sentiment. So let's jump in with our first role, the junglers. So kicking things off with the most obvious pick of all time, Aladdin is of course a top 3 jungler right now. Good luck actually playing him in ranked because he's practically permabanned, but this god is just insane. Crazy damage, crazy mobility, health resets with the ultimate, the wishes can completely swing a game in your favor. You've probably all seen what this god can do if you played any Smite 2 since open beta launch, and he probably doesn't need too much explanation, so let's move on. Next up we have Thanatos, who did get his nerf recently, but I think he is still a pretty strong pick, especially for stomping uncoordinated ranked and casual games. You can go either aspect or no aspects right now in my opinion, and both are pretty strong. You can go a bit of bruiser in your build, especially if you're rocking the aspect, or full damage, and both are strong. This god just deals so much damage, clears jungle insanely fast, has great sustain, and despite popular belief is very relevant late game, due to the execute and AA cancels hitting insanely hard. Definitely a top jungler right now, even after the nerfs. And my final jungler for the list is Loki, who has been pretty much a top jungler since Smite 2's inception, and while I don't think he's literally the best anymore like he was in the early days, he's still an incredibly strong god and one of the best hyper carry junglers for ranked and casuals due to uncoordinated or lower level teams not being able to capably deal with his constant invisibility and one-shots. The resetting cooldown on his vanish turned him from a god that one-shots a single guy and has to get out into a god that can run through entire fights by assassinating a backliner, going invisible, and re-engaging. Loki is still an incredibly strong jungler in OB2. There's a lot of great junglers right now though, so honorable mentions to Athena, Hercules, and Fenrir, who are all great too, especially if you want a bruiser jungle, but not quite top 3 in my opinion. Alright, moving on to the mid lane though, where my first pick is a pretty obvious one, that being Hecate. She's pretty much been a top mid since her release and remains so in open beta. Her base kit is great, but it's really that ultimate that makes her so ridiculous, as it can pretty much win fights on its own, or at the very least force multiple relics. You don't go the aspect in mid, but base kit Hecate is just nuts right now and has been for a long time. She can be a bit harder to play optimally than a lot of other mid lane picks, but if you're good at her, she's absolutely worth picking right now for mid. Next up, we have the newest Smite 2 god in Vulcan, who was released in a pretty strong state. I'm personally not on the trade of saying he's the best god in the game, but he's more than good enough to take a top 3 spot for mid in my opinion. He has the classic Vulcan burst damage with a good ult, being able to almost one-shot carries, steal or secure objectives, create space, or even self-heal by just ulting on yourself when you get dived. You can also go more turret focused if you want with the new changes and aspects, but from what I've seen, full burst damage Vulcan with the self mods is the best way to go right now, and he's an incredibly strong mid laner. And finally for mid, this one was a bit more of a tough choice, but ultimately I think Zeus is still really good with a full burst build from mid. He has been nerfed a bit, but he still does some of, if not the highest damage in the entire game from mid. A single chain lightning into the backline into detonate can easily half health most of a team, or 100 to 0 2 people if they're grouped up. He of course is one of the least safe mid laners out there, and you'll need good positioning and peel in the late game to avoid dying to dives from junglers and solo laners, but you can even just dump your ultimate on yourself and stun the divers into it and turn the fight pretty quickly. He's a more risky pick, but Zeus can be one of the hardest carries from mid lane in the game right now. For honorable mentions in mid, I have Agni and the Morrigan, who are also really strong right now, but not quite top 3 in my opinion. Moving on to ADC though, where we have a very clear top 3. First up is Jingwei, who I made a rant about recently and is just insanely strong right now. She's always been a top ADC ever since her release, with the +1 changes she got catapulting her into the meta. The amount of damage she outputs for how safe she is just ridiculous, and the new sharpshooter's arrow is arguably the best item in the game and feels like it was built specifically for her, with insane stats in every area she's looking for. You can be a bit slower to get online in the early game, but honestly not that bad, especially if you go the Linnean bow early on to help her with clear, and once you get to late game with this god, she can decimate entire teams in a matter of seconds, with her insane AoE crits and AA cancels from the 2. Moving on though, we have a slightly newer ADC in Ula, who's released incredibly overpowered and hasn't really been nerfed. He's much more fluid in Smite 2 and uses Heartseeker, one of the best items in the game right now, insanely well. You all know Ula. He hits an axe on you and basically asks if you have beads, and if if you don't, you die. His burst damage is insane, and while he might not quite have the shred of something like Jingwei, the fact that he can just one-shot a squishy out of nowhere more than makes up for that, and he's absolutely a top ADC right now. And finally, we have another relatively new ADC in Medusa, who is also really strong right now. Her one hits insanely hard and can often kill someone in just those 4 basic attacks, especially early game, and Medusa will often push out more late game ADCs in the laning phase and get a lead from that. I don't think Medusa is quite on the level of Jingwei and Ula, but she's not far behind and is definitely a top ADC at the moment. These 3 gods are so far above the rest of the ADCs right now that I don't really have any honorable mentions for the role, but I guess Aspect and her can be quite good if you like that. Moving on to the other duo lane role though, we have the support, so my first one should be no surprise. Yep, it's Yamoja. This is probably the god with the most appearances on these lists throughout Smite 1, and it remains so in Smite 2. She just breaks the game at a fundamental level if you can play her well, and while she is incredibly hard to maximize, definitely one of the hardest gods in the game to pilot, if you can play her well, she just does things no other support can do. She can solo backliners in the early and mid game by spamming her one, her ultimate can separate and decimate a team fight, she can sustain her team in and out of combat, Riptide is a perpetually underrated tool, you probably all know Yamoja if you play Smite 1, and she remains a top support in Smite 2 as well, if you can play her. Next up we have Geb, who is a more recent release, and the +1 changes he got for Smite 2 are some of the strongest we've seen yet. Knocking enemies straight up instead of away makes his one very deadly in team fights, his passive changes make him way tankier than almost any other god in the game, and he can even apply that passive to his allies through the shield. And of course, he still has the disgusting ult into 2 CC chain that can pretty much kill backliners with adequate follow-up from your team if they don't have beads. Of course, you don't go the Aspect on Geb support, losing that knockup is too much of a downside, but Geb pretty much does everything you need from support right now and is absolutely a top pick. And my final support for the list is another pretty obvious one if you played the later years of Smite 1 or any Smite 2 since her release. Aphrodite is still an incredible support in the sequel. She does very different things compared to a lot of the more frontline CC heavy supports that we see, but her ability to just keep a hyper carry ADC mid or jungler alive throughout an entire fight is insane. Her kiss sharing protections is even stronger in Smite 2 because flat penetration is less available, and of course her ultimate is one of the strongest abilities in the game, especially with the addition of her +1 allowing her to fly to the ulted ally. Good luck getting her in ranked as she's pretty much permabanned, but Aphrodite is an incredibly strong support right now. My honorable mentions for support go to Sobek and Ymir, who are both great right now, but just don't compete with these top 3 picks really. And finally we have the solo lane, where my first pick on the list is Hades, who I think is one of the strongest hard carry solo laners right now. Just build full damage and Helm of Darkness and you can nuke backliners very easily in the late game. The +1 change that lets him use a basic ability while ulting is crazy, as he is no longer hard countered by someone jumping or blinking out of his ult, and if you can find an enemy without those tools available, you can press 3 in the ult and just delete them in the blink of an eye. He can get bullied out in the very early levels of solo lane, but once he gets a few points into his 3, he has great sustain and good wave and camp clear to get a lead and start deleting carries in the late game. Next up for solo lane we have Ra, who I do think has had a significant fall off due to the nerfs to his Aspect and 2's ability proccing basic attacks. He's not the uncontested best solo laner in my opinion anymore, and you can actually bully him out of lane early on before he gets his proc items, and late game you can sometimes struggle with frontline and engaging if you have a Ra solo. All that said though, he is still ridiculously hard to kill with a tanky proc build, and once he gets a couple of items online, he will bully out almost any other solo laner and get a lead through pressure and taking all the local camps and totem for free. Ra is still great, but he definitely has had a bit of a fall off due to specific nerfs. And my final solo laner right now is a bit more of a wild card, and that's Bellona. In my opinion, Bellona has always been on the fringe of top tier for a while in Smite 2, but the recent meta where we're seeing multiple hunters on one team, or even just one single hunter like Jingwei abusing the OP ADC builds, Bellona can really shut that down late game, while also having a great laning phase with strong clear that allows her to pressure and take all of the neutral farm to get a lead. She's just strong in general, but also does really well into the current meta, and she's my last pick for solo lane. Honorable mention goes to Mordred with Aspect, who can do really well abusing ability proc items and has a very strong early to mid game, but does fall off a bit later on. But that's all of my picks and some honorable mentions for the top gods for every role in Smite 2. Let me know your thoughts down below, and I'll catch you guys for another one later on. Have a great day, and peace out, you nerds.